With that in mind, we approached the town at little more than walking pace, having discovered that the engine was marginally quieter at lower speeds, keeping the ever present dune fields between us and it for as long as possible to muffle the sound even further. Eventually, we crossed the line of a road, the smooth rockcrete arrowing away from town towards Emperor New Ware, and we turned along it. From this point on, stealth would be out of the question in any case, and our best bet was simply to make the best time we could into the relative shelter of the outskirts, assuming no one was waiting in ambush for anyone foolish enough to use the highway, of course. A quick glance was enough to reassure me that the possibility was remote. Judging by the thin film of wind, drifting sand covered the smooth gray surface, showing nothing had moved along it in a long time, certainly not for several days. And that meant that any defenders would be unlikely to be directing their attention towards it. That didn't mean the carriageway hadn't been mined, of course, and I was pretty sure Jurgen would notice any telltale irregularities in the road surface and react accordingly. So I tried not to think about that. I've got a bad feeling about this, I told him, sweeping the amplifier across the line of the walls, which made up the boundary of the town. On the smooth surface of the highway, the ride was much steadier, and I was able to keep them trained on the Vesta ahead, with no more effort than if we'd been scooting along in our faithful old salamander. Signs of fighting were everywhere, none of the structures I could see having been left undamaged, and several had collapsed entirely. The streets ahead were choked with fallen debris, although to my relief, none of it seemed to have been arranged to form barricades or weapon emplacements. Looks bad, Jurgen agreed, slowing to a skirt a couple of burnt-out ground cars, which must have evidently been hit by heavy weapons of some kind. They looked like civilian models, the thin sheet metal of their body ripped open like ration packs, and I tried not to look too closely at their contents. Whoever the occupants had been, they had been piled in regardless of the car's nominal carrying capacities. Their charred bones tumbled together in death, so thoroughly entangled, it would take a genitor majos to tell which bodies they'd originally come from. And the chances of that were negligible. Whoever these people were, only the Emperor knew. And probably only he cared. Refugees, if you ask me. Whether any of their fellows had made it to safety, or shared their fate, or simply fled to perish in the desert, there was no way of telling. All I could infer, with any certainty, was that the orcs had indeed been here, although whether they were still around or had moved on in search of more to defile and destroy, I could not be certain. The only prudent course of action was to assume that they were still infesting the area, and I instructed Jurgen to proceed with caution. Find somewhere we can park this thing, out of sight. And let's move in on foot. I want to know what we're getting into. The palms of my head were tingling again, and I trusted my subconscious enough to make notice of the presentment of danger. Very good, Commissar, my aide complied. With the usual speed and efficiency, coasting us to a halt, and the remains of a nearby fabricator unit. What had been produced here, I couldn't tell, the crushed and mangled machinery all around us being half buried by what remained of the roof, but I nodded in approval of his choice. The thick slabs of metal surrounding us would provide excellent cover if we had to conduct a fighting retreat. I would disrupt the outline of our vehicle on any aspect screen, assuming the greenskins had the brains to use such a thing, of course, and provide enough concealment for us to make our way deeper into the derelict settlement without attracting any attention, I hoped. I strained my ringing ears as Jurgen killed the engine, but heard nothing beyond the shuddering of my heart and the faint ticks of the cooling mechanism. Better let me go first, sir. Jurgen unslung his lasgun and scuttled to the nearest patch of daylight, squinting slightly as he crouched low and took aim at the street outside. After a moment, he raised a hand to indicate the coast was clear. No sign of life. Good, I said. And with rather more emphasis than I'd intended, and scrambled down from my position at the heavy bolter. I felt a little unsteady on my feet for a moment or two, no doubt as a result of the sudden cessation of the lurching motion I'd grown used to. By the time I crossed the floor to join him, the momentary flash of vertigo had faded away as swiftly as it had come. I drew my las pistol and chainsword as I trotted forwards, feeling instantly calmer for having weapons in my hands again, and crouched down next to Jurgen, trying not to breathe too deeply through my nose. So the thing about Jurgen is he is a pariah, which is interesting because I believe that Cain is a psyker of some sort. He has prescience in one form or another. The itchy palm thing is there to show you that he's in trouble. But I guess the other explanation for this is he's simply more human than human. He's simply larger than life. I guess that could be it too, because Jurgen's power is supposed to nullify Cain, and Cain should feel like horrified at having a psyker next to him. I mean, having a null or a pariah next to him. Funnily enough, pariah. Yeah, pariah used to be a Necron thing, but now it's not. It used to be a Necron thing. Good, I said, with rather more emphasis than I intended, and scrambled down from my point at the heavy bolter. I drew my las pistol and chainsword as I trotted forwards, feeling instantly calmer for having weapons in my hands again, and crouched down next to Jurgen, trying not to breathe too deeply through my nose. Outside, the mid-morning sun struck hard from the face of the building opposite, another industrial structure, which had once housed a power plant of some kind, judging by the tendrils of piping emanating from it in all directions. Now it was a roofless ruin, evidently the result of a massive explosion within. A contingency the architect had obviously allowed for if the meter-thick wall were anything to go by. Even so, the facade had cracked, slumping warily in several places, and the doors and windows were shattered, lying in pieces across the boulevard, which separated the two structures. I assumed that the power plant itself had gone up, probably a result of the attendant tech priests being killed or forced to abandon their posts, as there was relatively little sign of combat damage to be seen. The consequences had been severe for everything else in the vicinity, however, including the buildings we were taking refuge in. The rent in the wall through which we were able to observe this was clearly the result of flying debris from the explosion. That made a mess, my aide commented, superficially. I nodded. Let's hope it took most of the greenies with it. As the Emperor wills it, Jurgen agreed. A face he tended to trot out as the verbal equivalent of a shrug. Right after all, the Greenskins had abandoned flames. Both sexes, apparently gunned down or hacked to pieces as they tried to flee. The enemy hadn't all on their own, though. There were greenskin corpses lying around, massively muscled brutes, like the ones we'd fought off in the desert. This happened some time ago, I concluded, pausing to examine the corpse of the local arbitrator looted by Greeny that killed him. But it evidently some sort of high-caliber auto pistol, judging by the wounds left in nearby Gretchen. The corpse, like all the others, had become desiccated by the cadavers, and clearly wishing he had a can of Promethean at hand. While we moved from one patch of concealment to the next, relying on comm beads that keep us in touch. Although from habit, we continued to supplement the Vox link with hand gestures, keeping transmissions to a minimum. I was just about to leave the shelter of a shop doorway, an apothecary's, if I remember right, when he held up a hand to forestall me and slipped into the shadows of a refuse bin. Dostals, he voxed, readying his weapon, and I readied the las pistol against my other arm, crouching low and taking aim down the street. I didn't have to wait long for a target. A moment later, a mob of Gretchen ambled into view, chattering and screeching among themselves, and their barbarous tongue pushing a large handcart. A single orc was with them, clearly in charge, urging them along with insolent bellows and frequent blows, which the smaller greenskins generally ignored in favor of squabbling amongst themselves. The cart was loaded with corpses, and remembering the grisly snack we discovered in the locker of the buggy we'd acquired, I had a horrible suspicion at their eventual destination. Hold fire, I replied, as quietly as I could. In the distance, my aide nodded grimly. Tempting as the target was, and consumed as we were both undoubtedly were, with the righteous anger all subjects of the Emperor would have felt at the moment, there was no point in drawing attention to ourselves by giving way to our emotions. The faint wash of static in my comm intensified for a moment. Say again, a tenuous voice inquired, and faded back into inaudibility. I glanced up at Jurgen, prepared to repeat the instruction, but he was looking back in my direction, and even at this distance, I could tell the expression of puzzlement on his face. Commissar? His voice sounded in my ear as clearly as if I were standing right next to me. I glanced back at the cavalcade of greenskins, but they were clearly still unaware of our presence, moving away now at brisk pace, as their orc overseer could urge them to. I gestured him to silence. There's someone else on this frequency, I told him, and boosted the gain as best I could. Fortunately, he had enough sense to keep quiet after that, and just nodded in acknowledgement, before returning his attention to the retreating greenies. I listened hard, trying to make out another voice through the hissing in my earpiece. Unidentified. Contact. Respond. Sergeant Tabor. Bravo Squad. Filtered through the static. Who the warp? Commissar Kane. Serving with the 12th Valhallan Field Artillery, I said. What's your position? Getting desperate. The greenskins were out of sight by this time. Jurgen was moving back to join me. Even broken up by static as it was, the voice had an incredulous edge. Did you say, Nassar? Yes, where are you? I repeated, unsure how much of what I was saying was getting through. I was used to Imperial Guard Voxnets, but this sounded like a PDF setup, which was liable to be by far less sophisticated. For all I knew, we could have been practically on top of him. South Dur, hydration. What left of it? South Sector, Hydro Station, I confirmed. We'll find out. If the knees find you, the voice added encouragingly. The whole crawling with the. We'll proceed with caution, I assured him, as my aide returned to my side and cut the link. This didn't sound promising. Whatever the Sergeant Tabor was, it seemed he was halfway across this orc-infested killing zone, and joining him would entail a significant risk. Probably the safest thing to do would be to head out to the buggy and resume our journey as best we could. On the other hand, he was the first Imperial soldier we've been able to contact since we landed on this godforsaken rock, and might know where the bulk of our forces are. All in all, it seemed my best chance of survival to try to link up. And if some of his squad was still around too, so much the better. The more troopers I had standing between the orcs and me, the happier I'd feel. South is that way, Jurgen said, looking up from the compass he'd extracted from somewhere in his collection of pouches, and pointing helpfully in the direction of the foraging party of greenskins had just taken. I sighed deeply. It would be. Something that I have to realize, and it took me way too long to realize this, is there is quite a bounty to reap if you warm up. Warming up is great. I mean, physical activity is good, but like, really anything. When you go from a state of being inert to moving, like that's a pretty big shift. So you always want to give yourself a little time to warm up. I'm not that strong, but I'm glad I've got what I got. There are people, when in comparison, are mightier than me, but I know that on several other fronts I would defeat them. I suppose I like Commissar Kane because, he's a Renaissance man. He's a warrior. He's a leader. He's a philanthropist. He's a lady killer. He has ambition far beyond his station. He has a sort of Dr. Livesey-esque sort of demeanor. How embarrassing. Despite my obvious apprehension, our journey through the heart of the devastated town passed without incident. Which is to say that, to my vague surprise, Drug and I made it to the south sector without getting killed. There were a number of narrow squeaks, however. The closer we got to the center of things, the more greenskins we saw, and other sights too, which even at this remove, I'd rather not dwell on. Once we passed the shrine to the Emperor, shattered and desecrated, its offerings looted, now, judging by the stench, being used by the orcs as a makeshift latrine. Even that vile as it had been, was eclipsed by our first sight of the main administrative building in the center of town. It had clearly once but an elegant and well proportioned structure, facing a wide paved square in which fountains had played and artfully sided colonnades had provided shade for the townspeople going about their business. Now it bore a garland of twisted corpses hanging from the windows and statues, no doubt the civic and spiritual leaders of the community. Judging by the number of ministratum and ecclesiarchy robes I could see, few had died easily, that much was clear, despite the familiar desecration of the cadavers. Jurgen hawked and spat, and I looked and nodded, my own feelings far beyond words. In latter years, I was able to see just as bad, if not worse, on far too many occasions. But at that time, I had yet to encounter the minions of the dark powers, the Necrons, or the infinitely refined sadism of the chaos-touched Eldar. And perhaps for that reason, the memories remained so strong. Right then, I wanted nothing more than to exterminate every greenskin on the planet, with my bare hands if I had to. But my survival instinct reasserted itself before I could give way to the impulse to avenge these sorry victims and the next of the creatures to cross our path. There were plenty of them to be seen, large and small, scuttling around on incomprehensible errands of their own, most of which seemed to involve shouting very loudly or hitting one another. On a couple of occasions, we saw weapons drawn to resolve a quarrel, although none of the combatants seemed to take permanent harm from a mere axe wound or bullet hole, and most of the others in the vicinity simply ignored the fracas. Adding to the din was the perpetual roar of their ramshackle vehicles, which hurtled about the place with complete disregard for the safety of either their occupants or any pedestrians in their path, as well as the buggies and bike things we'd seen before. I was able to make out some larger vehicles, which looked vaguely like heavily armored trucks, and one which might have been intended as a tank, but which looked like nothing so much as a demon-possessed pile of scrap metal rattling past, crewed by whooping orcs. On several occasions, we saw foraging parties like the first we'd encountered, although not all were in search of fresh meat. Some of the carts were piled high with stuff only a tech priest could recognize, while other groups seemed bent on collecting nothing but scrap metal. To my shock and surprise, in some cases, what I'd assumed to be even scrawnier Gretchen than usual proved on closer inspection through the amplivisor to be human prisoners. I pointed out the haggard, shuffling figures to Jurgen with an inarticulate sound of revulsion, and he nodded grimly. "They'll not last long," he said, and I was forced to agree. Indeed, they must have possessed exceptional fortitude, or faith in the Emperor, to have survived their enslavement for as long as they had. No doubt, the atrocity of the administrative building had been intended to intimidate the survivors into acquiescence, and it looked from here as though it had succeeded in that aim. "There's nothing we can do for them," I said, moving a little deeper into the cover of a shattered wall. Trying to liberate the poor wretches would only get us killed, and none of them looked in any condition to make a run for it anyways. Nevertheless, it was in a sober mood that we continued on our perilous journey. At length, we hit a watercourse and took to it gratefully, wading waist high in the blessedly cool liquid. The sun was almost at its zenith, and the relief from the baking heat was more than welcome. I drew the line at drinking it, of course, continuing to use the canteen at my waist for that. No telling where it had come from, or what was contaminating it, especially with an army of greenskins in town. If you think that makes it remarkably foolish for us to go on paddling in the stuff You've clearly never experienced desert heat or tried playing tag with orcs, let alone both at the same time. Despite moving as carefully as we could to avoid betraying our presence by sloshing around too loudly, we made good time. For most of its length, the aqueduct was lined with concrete walls, which rose higher than our heads, making it hard to see our surroundings. But by the same token, giving us some welcome concealment from the greenskins. Jurgen's compass told us we were moving in roughly the right direction still, and after a while, during which time the hubbub of the orc host, going on their business, had faded away, I deemed the time was right to stick out our heads and see where we were. Fortunately, at this point, the walls of the aqueduct were sloping and lined with precast rockcrete slabs, which afforded ourselves excellent footing. So we were able to make our way to the top and lie completely concealed below ground level, apart from our heads. I raised mine cautiously, seeing no sign of life, and we scrambled up, Jurgen at my heels as always. While he dropped to a crouch, Lasgun at the ready, I raised the amplivisor. "We're here," I said, picking out a sign on a nearby industrial unit, informing me that it was the property of South Sector Plumbing Supplies. Like everywhere else we'd so far been in this stricken community, the buildings bore scars of the fighting or orc vandalism, although there were fewer corpses in the street, and more of the structures seemed to have roofs. I activated the comm bead. "Tabor, this is Kane. Respond." For a moment, nothing happened, and I listened for the familiar hints of static in my ears, with tension winding inexorably in my gut. If this turned out to be a sump rat chase, and we'd come through all those orcs for nothing. "Wait one," a voice said in my ear. Surprisingly clearly. The channel must have remained open, though, because I was able to distinguish a muttering of voices, though not the words. A moment later, the voice returned. "He's on his way." "Good," I said. "And who are you?" "Grinbo, sir. Commissar, sir. Vox specialist, second class. Sir, Commissar." "One of the other will do," I said, hiding my irritation as best as I could. PDF, without a doubt, probably never seen a scarlet sash in their lives before, and with only the haziest idea of what a commissar actually was. I suppose proper guardsmen wouldn't have been too much to hope for, but if this Grenbow was typical of the locals, it sounded as though I'd have been better off following my first impulse and just getting the hell out of Prosperity Wells while I had the chance. Oh well, too late to worry about that now. And at least it sounded as though Tabor had a few grunts with him. These I could hide behind. After all, if they were still on the loose this long after the orcs had occupied the town, they must have something going for them. "How many of you are there?" "7 effectives. 2 walking wounded." A new voice came on the box, calmer, more resolute, and vaguely familiar. Obviously, whoever it was, I'd spoken to before. "Where are you?" All right. I've got to get the voices down. It's hard to figure out while you're reading without breaking pace, but having consistent voices, having the right voice speak at the right time is very important, I think, in conveying consistency. Okay. It's not even about how skillful you are or how good you are at doing something. It's about knowing when to do it and then following through. Or even more importantly, knowing when not to do it. If you can't follow through, at least know when not to do it. Flunk alert. Grinbo, sir. Commissar, I mean, sir. Lock specialist, second class, sir. I mean, Commissar. One or the other will do. How many of you are there? 7 effectives, 2 walking around. A new voice came on the Vox, calmer, more resolute, and vaguely familiar. Obviously, whoever it was is who I'd spoken to before. Where are you? We're outside a plumbing supplies warehouse on Oil Drum Lane. I've been able to read the street sign quite clearly through the amplifier. How do I reach your position? You don't. Tabor sounded about as trusting as Colonel Mostrew. For all I know, you're a greeny collaborator with a scavenged box. We'll come to you. Frack that, I said heatedly. If you think we're going to sit around here in the open waiting to be picked off, then find some cover. The voice went dead with the box. Jurgen and I looked at one another. Clearly this Tabor was as cautious as I was. Despite the clear breach of protocol, I began to think I'd made the right choice after all. And if it turned out I hadn't, I could always shoot him for insubordination. Well, you can hardly blame the man for being cautious, I said, trying not to grin at my aide's outraged expression. I gestured towards the warehouse. We might as well wait in there. Very good, sir. Crouching low behind a pallet of surprisingly undamaged ceramic sanitary units, we began making our way towards the refuge it offered. We were almost there when Jurgen hesitated and raised his head. Can you hear that, sir? Yes. The sound drifted towards us on a light breeze. It was struck pleasantly cool through the gently streaming fabric of my trousers. I nodded grimly at the unmistakable crack of las bolts and the harsher bark of crude firearms. Gunfire. It seemed Sergeant Tabor wouldn't be joining us after all. What do we do now, sir? Jurgen asked. I shook my head regretfully. The way I saw it, prudent retreat would be the most sensible course of action. Before the noise of the firefight attracted the attention of every greenskin within earshot. Hard luck on the gallant sergeant, of course. But there didn't seem to be anything I could do about that now. He'd just have to take his chances with the rest of his men. We get the frack out of here, I said. An instant before, the commode beside my head shattered into 1,000 pieces. 3 orcs were charging us, blazing away with their crude bolt pistols, fortunately with the complete lack of accuracy common to their kind. That wouldn't be enough to keep us unscathed for long, though, so we returned fire with a will, taking the time to aim our own shots carefully. Time and time again, I found that the fraction of a second it takes to aim, sure, each las bolt counts, is worth more than all the wild firing in the galaxy. Of course, if you just blaze away in the general direction of the enemy, you'll usually persuade him to keep his head down. Unless you're dealing with greenskins, necrons, or cornate loonies, of course. But if he's got a cooler head than yours, he'll be using that time to make sure he takes off your head at the shoulders with his next squeeze of the trigger. Far better, in my view, to make sure you're the one taking the trouble to aim. And if he's doing the same, do it first. Anyway, I remembered enough from our skirmish back at the crash site to go for a headshot, taking down the leader with a las bolt through the cranium, while Jurgen did the same for his flankers. Remembering how hard they'd been to kill, I didn't take any chances, running forward as soon as they dropped to take what remained of their heads off with my chainsword. I didn't care how resilient they were. They were going to get back up after that. Right behind you, sir, Jurgen assured me, his distinctive odor announcing the fact a second or so before his voice did. Which way? Down there, I said, gesturing in the opposite direction to where our erstwhile assailants had appeared from. If there were any more of them, it was carrots to credits. They'd be that way too. Jurgen nodded and checked the level of the power cell in his weapon. It seemed satisfactory, and he leveled it. Well, I took a quick look around. Sure enough, there was a flash of movement, just where I most dreaded it would be. And we started moving, angling away from the approaching reinforcements, keeping our heads down, and hoping the warehouse had a sufficiently large stock of commodes to conceal our progress. No such luck, of course. Although we'd been able to open up a reasonable lead before our pursuers noticed us. Glancing back, I noticed a dozen or so of the hulking creatures jogging forward with that same unexpected fluidity of movement I noticed before. Expressions of belligerent curiosity on their faces, their head and shoulders bobbing incongruously above the stacks of sanitary supplies. A couple of them surged forward abruptly, bellowing something incomprehensible in their barbarous tongue, and halted beckoning the others to join him. Clearly, they just found the trio Jurgen and I had dispatched a few moments before. Time we are out of here, I muttered to my aide, and he nodded, not bothering to reply. I indicated the warehouse, now only a few meters away. A blue-painted metal door stood invitingly ajar, seemingly close enough to touch, but across an open space with no sign of cover. Going back the way we'd come wasn't an approach, so we just have to chance it. A sudden increase and the volume of the orc bellowing behind us drew my eyes in that direction for a moment, just long enough to confirm my guess that a brawl had taken out over the possession of the ones we just killed. And I nodded decisively. We weren't going to get a better chance. That much was certain. Now, I said, with an urgent undertone. Right behind you, sir. My faithful aide responded, and we sprinted for the sanctuary of the portal. We'd almost made it when a concerted roar of "Wah!" behind us, punctuated by a spattering brick of dust, a fusillade of badly aimed shots, and heavy slugs, gouged their distinctive signatures out of the wall, made it apparently clear that we'd been spotted. Inside, I suited the action to the word, wondering an instant too late if there were greenskins already inside the building, and whether it might have been more prudent to send Jurgen in first. But to my relief, the place seemed deserted. A moment later, my aide joined me, and we pushed the door closed behind us, with a squeal of rusted metal. Clearly, it had been hanging ajar ever since the orcs had first attacked the town. Left unsecured in the general panic, and for a horrified moment, I wondered if it had corroded too badly to use. The surge of adrenaline I felt at the thought proved more than enough to overcome any residual resistance, however, and it thudded into place not a moment too soon. That won't hold them for too long. That won't hold them for too long, sir, Jurgen said helpfully, smacking home a couple of reassuringly solid locking bolts. A moment later, the steel door shivered on its hinges as our pursuers caught up with it, presumably not bothering to slow down first. As usual, Jurgen sounded surprisingly unconcerned, seemingly convinced I had matters well under control, and I found his phlegmism strangely reassuring. Let's hope it doesn't have to, I said, and activated the comm beat again. Tabor, what's your position? Reamed, he responded almost at once. We're pinned down and surrounded. How about you? Likewise, I flinched reflexively as a crude grenade resembling nothing so much as a ration tin stuck to a length of piping sailed through the nearby window and rolled under a shelving unit of what looked like air conditioners. Jurgen and I had just enough time to dive for cover behind a reassuringly solid pallet full of boilers before it detonated, spraying the room with shrapnel, which ricocheted off the metal cylinders with a rattle like a Galavan rainstorm. Do you have a plan? Take as many as of the Grox Reamers with us as we can. The box went dead with a suddenness, which would have left me fearing for Grinbo's safety if I had any concern to spare from worrying about mine. Either way, it didn't sound like much of a plan to me. Are you all right, sir? Jurgen asked. Rising cautiously to inspect the damage, I nodded. For the moment, I said, as casually as I could, trying to ignore the rhythmic thudding on the door. From the bursts of raucous laughter which accompanied each impact, I deduced the orcs were taking it in turns to run at the barrier, hoping to batter it down with their heads, an impression Jurgen confirmed a moment later with a cautious look through another nearby window. Why don't they just blow it down? He asked. Honestly puzzled, I shrugged. Frack knows, I said. The longer they kept up the game, the better I liked it. It gave us a fighting chance of finding another way out of them. It was only as I began to understand more about what passed for the thought processes of these creatures that the incident began to make sense in retrospect. So far as they were concerned, we weren't going anywhere. And given their tendency to impulsive behavior and constant jockeying for social status, it was almost inevitable that trying to get us would develop into another of their interternal competitions of strength and bravado. They're on this side too, Jurgen reported, somewhat there you go, Commissar Kane. Superfluously. As the thudding began to be echoed from the direction of the truck-sized doorway, giving access to the loading dock. It didn't look as though there'd be much point in trying to get out that way either, I thought. Shame, really. There was a lorry parked in the bay, which would have been a damn sight more comfortable than the orc bone shaker we'd commandeered. If we could have got to it to a run, that is, a dribble of lubricant ran from somewhere underneath it to vanish down a drainage hole in the corner of the floor. Jurgen, look for an inspection hatch. I pointed to the drain, which was only about a quarter of a meter across, far too small for either of us to fit. It seemed a pretty fair bet that it led to a sewer or something, though, and that would require periodic maintenance. Prosperity Wells was far too small to have accumulated a proper undercity over the centuries, but there was bound to be a tunnel system of some kind we could access. Of course, there wasn't. Convenient drain covers leading to easily accessible escape routes may be abundant in the cheaper kind of escapist fiction. But if my experience over the years had been anything to go by, they're depressingly rare in real life. A few moments of frantic searching was enough to convince me of the fact, and I just began to think about firing up one of the torches I'd noticed on a nearby shelf in a futile attempt to burn through the grating over the too small hole I'd found before. But a rather more practical notion occurred to me. I pointed to the truck. See if you can get that thing started, I ordered, before grabbing an armful of the torches and running back towards the besieged rear entrance. To my relief, the door still held, although it was looking pretty battered now, and the bolts securing the hinges to the wall were beginning to work clear of the brickwork. Judging by the noise outside, the crowd of orcs had grown too considerably, And there was no time to worry about that either. Fortunately, everything I needed was in the was in was within easy reach, including the pallet of boilers we sheltered from during the grenade explosion. I selected the nearest and tipped a pile of blazing torches inside, pausing only to unscrew the nozzle and igniter unit from the last one. And I dropped it on top of its fellows, hastily holding my breath as I screwed a metal cover snatched from a nearby shelf over the large hole on the top of the boiler intended for the main outlet pipe. Okay, and he does a bunch of other technical stuff. And then he's done doing technical stuff. Praying fervently to the Emperor not to let me fumble now, I threaded a thin piece of wire through the trigger of the igniter unit and loped it to the handle of the door. As I stepped back, it shifted again on its frame with a louder thud, hitherto, and correspondingly loud chorus of approbation from the assembled greenskins outside. My heart slipped as the wire tightened, but my luck held, and the makeshift trigger didn't give enough to detonate the improvised booby trap. Mouth dry, I hurried back to Jurgen, hoping he'd make some progress in the interim. So he made a bomb, and I mean, I don't know. I get why he described it. I get why he described